Hello, John. Here we go. These are the times that try men's souls. Into that. Before I begin today's reading, I want to read from the Red Book. I'm going to read the last page of The Way of What Is to Come, which is on page 126 of the Reader's Edition. I think the page is 231 in the folio edition. On this page, Dr. Jung is actually predicting our times. And so I want to give you a sense of what he was saying. He said, "I will be no savior, no lawgiver, no master teacher unto you. You are no longer little children. Giving laws, bettering, making things easier has all become wrong and evil. May each one seek his own way. The way leads to mutual love and community. Men will come to see and feel the similarity and commonality of their ways. Laws and teachings held in common compel people to solitude so that they may escape the pressure of undesirable contact. But solitude makes people hostile and venomous. Therefore, give people dignity and let each of them stand apart, so that each may find his own fellowship and love it. Power stands against power, contempt against contempt, love against love. Give humanity dignity and trust that life will find the better way. The one eye of the Godhead is blind. The one ear of the Godhead is deaf. The order of its being is crossed by chaos. So be patient with the crippledness of the world and do not overvalue its consummate beauty." Now, so happens, I don't know if I can show it to you, but I'm going to try. Let's see what I have, whether I got it here or not. Yes. Okay, so this morning I prepared a calligraphy, and it's taken from this quote that I just read. And so I'm going to share it with you now. It's far from perfect. I've only had 4 calligraphy. Whoops, that didn't. Okay, that's it, I guess. I've only had 4 classes, officially calligraphy classes, and I've been taking them as a step toward making my own red book. And so this was my first attempt at putting something in a formal sheet other than a practice sheet. And so I did make several errors in this. This is far from perfect, but I was just in communication with Thomas Arst, who's the driving force behind Jung's Red Book for our time, and who wrote the first essay in that series, which has the same name as the chapter that this comes from, which is The Way of What Is to Come. And he said that it's best if we all take this opportunity to work on our own red books. And that means going inside and trying to decide what's important to us and maybe recording it. Now, this piece that I did this morning is flawed in a number of ways. Number one, I didn't realize that the watercolor paper I was using was so heavily toothed. So my pen kept sticking in it, and I missed a couple of words and had to squeeze them in. But you get the idea. And so I will be making a better copy of this to put into my personal red book. But And this is only an abbreviated version of what Dr. Jung said, which I just read. So, today I offered to um, read chapter 7 of the Bible and the Psyche, Individuation, Symbolism in the Old Testament by Dr. Edward F. Edinger. And keeping in mind that from a psychological perspective, um, the Bible is a series of stories which help one go through the transformations of life that are necessary in individuation. And this is how we learn. Now, we also, these days, we learn from movies and television programs and crises in our countries, and those can be very painful. And we come to consciousness very painfully, and so there will be a great deal of pain coming at us. I just heard, as I was coming in here, that a New Jersey family has already lost 3 members of the family last week and has 3 other members who are in the ICU. So we can all pray for them. But this is the sort of thing that is going to happen to us. And so please be very careful. One of my friends sent me a notice from Johns Hopkins, and it's probably worthwhile for me to read that to you so that you understand why this is so much a crisis right now. And here's what she said. This is from an immunologist at Johns Hopkins University. Feeling confused as to why coronavirus is a bigger deal than seasonal flu, here it is in a nutshell. I hope this helps. Feel free to share this to others who don't understand. It has to do with RNA sequencing, i.e., genetics. Seasonal flu is an all-human virus. The DNA RNA chains that make up the virus are recognized by the human immune system. This means that your body has some immunity to it before it comes around each year. You get immunity 2 ways, through exposure to a virus or by getting a flu shot. Novel viruses come from animals. The WHO, the World Health Organization, tracks novel viruses in animals, sometimes for years, watching for mutations. Usually these viruses only transfer from animal to animal, pigs in the case of H1N1, birds in the case of the Spanish flu. But once one of these animal viruses mutates and starts to transfer from animals to humans, then it's a problem. Why? Because we have no natural or acquired immunity. The RNA sequencing of the genes inside the virus isn't human, and the human immune system doesn't recognize it, so we can't fight it off. Now, sometimes the mutation only allows transfer from animal to human. For years, its only transmission is from an infected animal to a human before it finally mutates so that it can now transfer human to human. Once that happens, we have a new contagion phase. And depending on the fashion of this new mutation, that's what decides how contagious or how deadly it's going to be. H1N1 was deadly, but it did not mutate in a way that was as deadly as the Spanish flu. Its RNA was slower to mutate, and it attacked its host differently, too. Fast forward. Now here comes this coronavirus. It existed in animals only for nobody knows how long. But one day at an animal market in Wuhan, China, in December 2019, it mutated and made the jump from animal to people. At first, only animals could give it to a person. But here's the scary part. In just 2 weeks, it mutated again and gained the ability to jump from human to human. Scientists call this ability slippery. This coronavirus, not being in any form a human virus, whereas we would all have some natural or acquired immunity, took off like a rocket, and this was because humans have no known immunity. Doctors have no known medicines for it. And it just so happens that this particular mutated animal virus changed itself in such a way, the way that it causes great damage to human lungs. That's why coronavirus is different from seasonal flu or H1N1 or any other type of influenza. This is this one is slippery AF, and it's a lung eater, and it's already mutated again so that we now have two strains to deal with, strain S and strain L, which makes it twice as hard to develop a vaccine. We really have no tools in our shed with this. History has shown that fast and immediate closings of public places has helped in past pandemics. Philadelphia and Baltimore were reluctant to close events in 1918, and they were the hardest hit in the U.S. during the Spanish flu. Factoid: Henry VIII stayed in his room and allowed no one near him till the Black Plague passed. Honestly, I understand him so much better now. Just like us, he had no tools in his shed except social isolation. And let me end by saying right now, it's hitting older folks harder. But this genome is so slippery. If it mutates again, and it will, who is to say what it will do next? Be smart, folks. Acting like you're unafraid is so not sexy right now. Flatten the curve, stay home, folks, and share this to those that just are not catching on. So this message has been brought to you by the Spanish flu of 1918, and the reason for that is that in 1918, my grandfather was engaged to a woman who, together with her four sisters in Philadelphia, all died of the Spanish flu on one weekend. And therefore, my grandfather married my grandmother, and I became possible. And so that message was brought to you by the Spanish flu of 1918. So Gray, who is a science teacher, says, or he's a biology teacher, this is good science. RNA interactivity with other genetic forms is the best guess science currently on how life began, RNA world theory. Okay, so, all right, Bill, I will stick with Carl, and I will also be answering your questions later. But I feel Thomas Arst, who was the guiding light or the moving force in Jung's Red Book for our time, just said to me right before I came online here that the world is going crazy, and so we all need to pay attention to that first and foremost. Okay, so I'm reading from the Bible and the Psyche, Individuation, Symbolism in the Old Testament by Edward F. Edinger, Chapter 7. Joshua, Gideon, Samson, and Ruth. Joshua. The promised land was a gift from Yahweh to the Israelites, and yet it had to be conquered. It was not a gift freely given which the receiver may accept or decline. It was a command to take the land of Canaan. Those who declined were destroyed. Numbers 14:37. Psychologically, the promised land can be seen as an area of the unconscious which the imperative of individuation requires to be assimilated by the ego. This area is specifically assigned to the ego by the self, but still must be conquered by the efforts of the ego. The land is not vacant, but occupied. It is studied it is studded with fortified cities. That is, it contains defended unconscious complexes which must be resolved before it can be assimilated. Joshua's conquest of Canaan is a symbolic picture of how to deal with the unconscious and its hostile complexes under certain circumstances. Yahweh directs Joshua to enter Canaan and take possession of it. Quote, "Be strong and stand firm, for you are the man to give this people possession of the land that I swore to their fathers I would give to them. Only be strong and stand firm, and be careful to keep all the law which my servant Moses laid on you. Have the book of this law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may carefully keep everything that is written in it. Then you will prosper in your dealings. Then you will have the success. For go where you will, Yahweh your God is with you." Joshua 1:6-9. The growth urge summons the ego to proceed and cautions it to follow dutifully the dictates of one's inner law, the innate design of one's being. Then the totality of the psyche will cooperate. Spies were dispatched to reconnoiter the land around Jericho and were sheltered by Rahab the harlot. Joshua 2. A man's first foray into the unconscious discovers the helpful anima. According to Ginsburg, quote, "She had been leading an immoral life for 40 years, but at the approach of Israel, she paid homage to the true God, lived the life of a pious convert, and as the wife of Joshua, became the ancestress of 8 prophets and of the prophetess Huldah." Unquote. Rahab corresponds to the soul of Israel, who shares its 40 years of wandering. She is analogous to Sophia, who fell into the darkness of matter, the wilderness, and had to be rescued. Simon is said to have found his female companion, Helen, a manifestation of Sophia, in a brothel in Tyre. The relations between Rahab and Israel are mutual and reciprocal. Rahab protects the Israelite spies, and in return, she is saved. This is a typical theme of anima rescue stories, e.g., Jason and Medea, Theseus and Ariadne, etc. Among patristic writers, Rahab is a type of the church. As the church is the bride of Christ, so in legend, Rahab was the bride of Joshua, who is a type of his namesake, Jesus, Joshua. As the soul of Israel, Rahab is also the soul of the land which belongs to Israel. I am reminded of a dream dreamt by a Jewish man who had denied his Jewish origins. Quote, "I am in Israel in an open field on a hill. The hill is shaped exactly like a woman's breast. On the very top of the hill, where the nipple would be, was a beautiful girl, blonde, blue-eyed. Maybe she was Jewish, maybe not. I fall in love with her and pursue her, calling on the telephone. She laughs and finally says, 'Okay, stupid, come on over.' I go to the hill and meet her there, expecting to have a sexual experience. Instead, she tells me her story. She is from elsewhere. She married an Orthodox Jew, but he was impotent and buried himself in religion, neglecting her. She turned to others and had affairs with men. As I look at her, she seems to be a lost soul, drifting." Unquote. This dream, which followed a visit to Israel, pictures the dreamer's encounter with his lost anima, whose fate had paralleled that of the collective soul of Israel. Rahab's scarlet thread, the sign that all in her house should be spared, was important symbolically to the church fathers. It served the same function as the blood daubed on the doorposts at the Passover, and was considered to exemplify the saving blood of Christ. According to Clement, quote, they gave her, Rahab, a sign to this effect, that she should hang forth from her house a scarlet thread, and thus they made it manifest that redemption should flow through the blood of the Lord to all them that believe and hope in God. Unquote. Rahab is connected by her name with the primordial mother monster mentioned in Isaiah 51, 9 and 10. Quote, awake, awake, clothe yourself in strength, arm of Yahweh. Awake as in the past, in times of generations long ago. Did you not split Rahab in two and pierce the dragon through? Did you not dry up the sea, the waters of the great abyss, to make the seabed a road for the redeemed to cross? Unquote. In this passage, Rahab is a personification of the watery chaos existing prior to creation. She corresponds to the Babylonian Tiamat, who was slain by Marduk in the creation of the world. It is the hero's task to slay the primordial aspect of the great mother, dragon, which in many myths has the effect of rescuing the anima. As Neumann puts it, quote, the transformation which the male undergoes in the course of the dragon fight includes a change in his relation to the female, symbolically expressed in the liberation of the captive from the dragon's power. In other words, the feminine image extricates itself from the grip of the terrible mother, a process known in analytical psychology as the crystallization of the anima from the mother archetype. Something, unquote, something of this sort of transformation takes place in Israel's relation to the feminine with the conquest of Canaan. Rahab, the monster, is transformed into Rahab, the helpful woman. She is rescued from the enemy, and according to legend, true to the archetypal pattern, she marries Joshua. She marries Joshua, her rescuer. Does this sound like courtship and rescuing a young woman from her mother? Maybe. Just as the 40 years of wilderness wandering was inaugurated by a rite of entry, the crossing of the Red Sea, so a rite of exit crossing the River Jordan, marks the termination of the wilderness experience. The transition was signaled by the fact that manna ceased to fall, Joshua 5:12. And we hear no more about the guiding pillar of cloud and pillar of fire. The theme of crossing a river, a border, or even a highway comes up in dreams to indicate a major transition from one level of consciousness to another. Such a crossing often requires evidence of one's identity and commitment. With the crossing of the Jordan, this evidence is presented by the mandala of 12 stones set up at Gilgal. The word Gilgal means ring of stones, according to the Jerusalem Bible, page 279, note E. Joshua 4:20. The fact that the waters of the Jordan parted for the crossing, as had the Red Sea, expresses the theme of the easy passage. This refers to the psychological fact that when the self is activated and the ego has finally decided to take a major step, the execution of the decision may be remarkably easy because of cooperation from the unconscious. Joshua receives precise directions from Yahweh for the conquest of Jericho. Quote, "All your fighters, valiant warriors, will march round the town and make the circuit once, and for 6 days you will do the same thing. On the seventh day, you will go 7 times round the town. When the ram's horn rings out, the whole people must utter a mighty war cry, and the town wall will collapse then and there. Then the people can storm the town, each man going straight ahead." Joshua 6, 3 through 5. This is a recipe for the resolution of an unconscious complex. It must be circumambulated, experienced from all sides repeatedly. Circular movement around a center has the psychic effect of focusing energy on the center by constellating the self as a field of force. The crossing of the Jordan was sealed by the mandala image of the ring of stones. Now that image is being invoked again to breach the defenses of Jericho. Circumambulatio is a powerful process that constellates the self. Jung describes it in his commentary on The Secret of the Golden Flower. Quote, "Circumambulatio is expressed by the idea of circulation. The circulation is not merely movement in a circle, but means, on the other hand, the marking off of the sacred precinct, and, on the other, fixation and concentration. The sun wheel begins to turn, the sun is activated and begins its course. Everything peripheral is subordinated to the command of the center. Psychologically, the circulation would be the movement in a circle around oneself, so that all sides of the personality become involved. The poles of light and darkness are made to rotate. That is, there is an alternation of day and night. The circular movement thus has the moral significance of activating the light and dark forces of human nature, and together with them all psychological opposites of whatever kind they may be. It is nothing less than self-knowledge by means of self-brooding. In Sanskrit, this is called tapas." Unquote. And that came from Alchemical Studies, Collected Works 13, paragraphs 38 and following. The sevenfold action alludes to the 7 planetary spheres of antiquity, each ruled by one of the 7 planetary deities. The complete 7 circuits implies integrating all 7 archetypal factors symbolized by the planets. With the 7th comes the shout announcing wholeness, and the complex collapses. Jericho and the other captured cities were placed under the ban by Yahweh. The town and everything inside it must be set apart for Yahweh under a ban. Joshua 6:15. The ban, haram, in Hebrew, or haram in Hebrew, but haram presumably in Islam, since this is the history of Islam as well at this point in history. The ban, haram in Hebrew, makes over all that is captured to God. Hence, men and animals are killed and booty given to the sanctuary. The ban is a religious act, a rule of holy war. Failure to observe it is sacrilege, and its punishment is severe." Unquote. When Achan defied the ban and kept some booty for himself, Joshua 7:1, the consequence was Israel's defeat at Ai. Yahweh tells Joshua, quote, They have taken what was under the ban, stolen and hidden it, and put it into their baggage. That is why the sons of Israel cannot stand up to their foes, why they have turned their backs on their enemies, because they have come under the ban themselves. I will be with you no longer unless you remove what is under the ban from among you. Joshua 7:11 and 12. Resort to such extreme measures reflects the dangerous nature of all Canaanite things to invading Israel. Israel is in the process of establishing its identity. Not only must it conquer the land of Canaan, but also it must impose its identity on the land. There are many historical examples of a country's conquering culturally its physical conquerors. Similarly, in the psychology of the individual, there are times of transition when it may be fatal to allow any consideration for the standpoint one is trying to overcome. An all or nothing condition must prevail. Only thus is the connection with the self preserved. So we're in that kind of a battle right now with the coronavirus. Gideon. As Israel occupied Canaan, it made a radical shift from nomadic to settled life. During the wandering and the conquest, Moses and Joshua provided central leadership, but now, in the so called period of the judges, there was a breakdown of centralized authority. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and every man did as he pleased. Judges 17:6. The conquest of Canaan was a partial, fluctuating, and disorderly process. Victories were followed by defeats and enslavement. Again and again, we read that the Israelites did what displeases Yahweh. They forgot Yahweh, their God, and served the Baals and the Asherahs. Then Yahweh's anger flamed out against Israel. Judges 3:7 and 8. And he allowed them to be enslaved by their enemies. Again, after each relapse comes repentance, and the Israelites cry to Yahweh, who raises up a leader or judge to rescue them. The fluctuating and chaotic time of the judges symbolizes the vicissitudes that accompany the ego's efforts to assimilate a major area of the unconscious. The outcome is often ambiguous for some time, as it remains uncertain whether the ego will assimilate the complex or the complex will assimilate the ego. The lack of a central authority reflects the weakness of the ego during the transition from one mode of life to another. Lacking a stable ego, reliance must be placed on sporadic, intermittent revelations from the self, represented by the charismatic judges who emerged in time of need to rescue Israel from its oppressors. One such judge was Gideon. At the time of Gideon's call, Israel was oppressed by the Midianites and subject to Baal worship. Yahweh directs Gideon to pull down the altar to Baal belonging to your father and cut down the sacred post at the side of it. Then build a carefully constructed altar to Yahweh your God. Judges 6:25 and 26. And allow a holy cost sacrifice. This is a grave matter. The near God image is demanding that the old God image be destroyed. An individual ego must be the agent of that action. Although the working of God can be perceived in human history, individuals must take the responsibility for effecting that work. They must become the carriers of the divine drama and suffer personally and concretely the consequences of God's actions. It is therefore understandable that when Gideon was ordered by Yahweh to take up arms against Midian, he, Gideon, wanted to be certain that this was indeed God's will and not an inflated, grandiose notion of his own. Gideon requested a sign from God. Quote, "If you really mean to deliver Israel by my hand, as you declare, see now I spread out a fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is left dry, then I shall know that you will deliver Israel by my hand, as you have declared." And so it happened. Judges 6:36, unquote. The sign was also manifested in reverse. Let the fleece alone be dry, and let there be dew on the ground all around it. And God did so that night. Judges 39:40. Dew is an important symbolic image. In Proverbs, a king's favor is like dew on the grass. Proverbs 19:12. The Messianic Psalm 72 speaks of the promised king welcome as rain that falls on the fleece. Verse 6, note, alternate reading, Moses says, quote, "May my teaching fall like the rain, may my word drop down like the dew, like showers on fresh grass, and light rain on the turf, for I proclaim the name of Yahweh." Deuteronomy 32:2. And on Hosea, Yahweh announces, "I will fall like dew in Israel. He shall bloom like the lily." Hosea 14:6. Irenaeus identifies Gideon's dew with the Holy Spirit. Augustine equates it with the grace of Christ and makes this observation, quote, "What meant Gideon's fleece? It is like the nation of the Jews in the midst of the world, which had the grace of sacraments, not indeed openly manifested, but hidden in a cloud or in a veil, like the dew in the fleece. The time came when the dew was to be manifested in the floor. It was manifested, no longer hidden. Christ alone is the sweetness of dew." Unquote. Gideon's dew also appears in alchemy. Ros Gideonis, Gideon's dew, is a synonym for the aqua permanens, hence for mercurius. It appears in figure 8 of the Rosarium pictures, about which Jung makes the following comment, quote, "An attitude that seeks to do justice to the unconscious as well as to one's fellow human beings cannot possibly rest on knowledge alone. That is why the purely intellectual attitude must be abandoned. Gideon's dew is a sign of divine intervention. It is the moisture that heralds the return of the soul." Unquote. Gideon's initial army of 32,000 was drastically reduced by Yahweh. First, all who were fearful were dismissed, leaving 10,000. Judges 7:3. This number was then reduced to 300 by an interesting device. Quote, "Take them down to the waterside. All those who lap the water with their tongues as a dog laps, place these on one side. With the 300 who lap the water, I will rescue you and put Midian into your power." Judges 7:4-7. This process of selection is an extraction procedure according to the formula 32 minus 10 minus 3. The extractions from the total of 32, first the number 10 and then the number 3. The final criterion for selection is the dog-like behavior of lapping water. In Psalm 68:23, Yahweh says he will arrange for the tongues of your dogs to lap their share of the enemy. Commenting on this passage, Augustine remarks, quote, "For it has not indeed to no purpose, not without a great mystery, that Gideon was bidden to lead them alone, who should lap the water of the river like dogs. As unquote, as carrion eater, the dog had negative associations in the Old Testament, but as a watchdog and sheep herder, a very positive one. Jung writes, quote, in the history of symbols, the dog is distinguished by an uncommonly wide range of associations. The Gnostic parallel, logos canis, is reflected in the Christian one, Christus canis, handed down in the formula, quote, gentle to the elect, terrible to the reprobate, a true pastor. St. Gregory says, quote, or what others are called the watchdogs of this flock, save the holy doctors. In the hieroglyphics of Horapollo, emphasis is laid on the dog's power to spread infection. Because of its rich symbolic context, the dog is an apt synonym for the transforming substance, unquote. Gideon's forces were assured of victory when spies overheard the dream of a Midianite. A cake, quote, a cake made the barley bread quote, a cake made of barley bread came rolling through the camp of Midian. It reached the tent, struck against it, and turned it upside down, and the tent lay flat. Judges 7:13. Such a dream in which an inanimate object affects a deliberate action indicates the activation of the autonomous psyche, the self. It is then imperative for the ego to align its attitude in accordance with the activated self. Otherwise, it will be knocked flat. Okay, there's two more parts of this, Samson and Ruth. Samson. The story of Samson, Judges 13-16, is that of a conjunctio gone wrong. It begins with a wedding between Samson the Israelite and the daughter of a Philistine. In the midst of the wedding feast, Samson poses a riddle, quote, out of the eater came what is eaten, and out of the strong came what is sweet. Judges 14:14. This refers to the honeycomb Samson found in the carcass of the lion he had killed. Judges 14:5-8. As with Oedipus, the riddle is the central issue of the story, and like Oedipus, Samson fails to address the deeper meaning of the riddle. What does it mean that out of the dead lion comes sweet honey? It signifies the transformation of the power principle. The Spirit of Yahweh dwelled in Samson, allowing him to do great deeds of valor and vengeance when under the influence of intense effect. For example, Judges 14:19. However, Samson was called to the conjunctio, which required that he become conscious of the opposites, both power and love. He failed that test. The vengeance principle prevails throughout the Samson story. For this reason, his Philistine anima turned against him. Thus is the one-sided ego undone by the unconscious in its effort to promote the larger standpoint of wholeness. The synchronistic event of finding a honeycomb in the body of the lion he had killed was meant to inform Samson, the Nazarite and man of God, that it was his task to contribute to the transformation of God. From this perspective, the lion's death and Samson's defeat and death are symbolically equivalent. They both picture the transformation of the archetypal power principle. The conjunctio Samson could not achieve in life occurs at his death, as both he and the Philistines perished together. Judges 16:30. Samson has analogies with both Mithra and Christ. Mithra sacrificed the bull, and Christ carried the cross, the instrument of his own self-sacrifice. There are pictures of Samson carrying the gates of Gaza, Judges 16:3, in the form of a cross. Blind Samson in prison turning the mill wheel, mandala, in Gaza, Judges 16:21, is an image of servitude to wholeness, an unconscious version of carrying the cross of the self. Irenaeus interprets Samson as a prefiguration of Christ. Quote, "The little boy, therefore, who guided Samson by the hand, pretypified John the Baptist, who showed to the people the faith in Christ, and the house in which they were assembled signifies the world in which dwell the various heathen and unbelieving nations, offering sacrifice to their idols. Moreover, the two pillars are the two covenants. The fact, then, of Samson leaning himself upon the pillars indicates this, that the people, when instructed, recognize the mystery of Christ," unquote. Referring to Judges 14:14, "Out of the eater came what is eaten, and out of the strong came what is sweet." Pisanalis says, quote, "This is to be understood of the Son of God, who, after having long imitated the terrible lion in rebuking the world's sins, a little later, when he instituted the most holy sacrament of the Eucharist, as his death drew nigh, turned himself into exceeding sweet honeycombs," unquote. Samson personifies the torturous process of transformation of the power motive, lion to honey, Yahweh to Christ. The strong man is turned into the blind, defeated slave, who yet from his captivity in darkness destroys the old temple in preparation for the new and generates a sweet food for the soul. John Milton had personal familiarity with the archetypal image of Samson. His great final poems, Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and Samson Agonists, were written in total blindness and during intermittent attacks of gout. These lines of Samson from the latter poem are an example of honey from the dead lion who had been Cromwell's polemist. Quote, "God of our fathers, what is man, that thou towards him with hand so various, or might I say contrarious, tempers thy providence through his short course, not evenly as thou rulest the angelic orders and inferior creatures, mute, irrational, and brute, nor do I name the men the common route. That wandering loose about, grow up and perish as the summer flea, heads without name no more remembered, but such as thou hast solemnly elected, with gifts and graces eminently adorned, to some great work, thy glory. The people's safety, which in part they affect, yet toward these thus dignified thou oft. Amidst their height of noon, changest thy countenance, and thy hand, with no regard of highest favors, passed from thee on them, or them on thee of service. Nor only dost degrade them, or remit to life obscured, which were a fair dismission, but throwst them lower, that thou didst exalt them high, unseemly falls in human eye. Too previous for the trespass or omission, oft leavest them to the hostile sword of heaven and profane their carcasses, to dogs and fowls a prey, or else captived, or to the unjust tribunals under change of times and condemnation of the ingrateful multitude. If these they escape, perhaps in poverty, with sickness and disease, thou bowest them down, painful diseases and deformed in crude old age, though not disordinate, yet causeless suffering, the punishment of dissolute days, in fine, just to unjust, alike seem miserable, for oft alike both come to evil end. So deal not with this once thy glorious champion, the image of thy strength and mighty minister. What do I beg? How hast thou dealt already? Behold him in this state calamitous, and turn his labors, for thou canst, to peaceful end. Lines 667 to 709. Okay, one more part. Ruth. The book of Ruth is an oasis of feminine charm in the patriarchal sternness of the Old Testament. Goethe called it the loveliest little epic and idyllic whole which has come down to us. Naomi, with her husband and 2 sons, moves from Israel to Moab because of famine in Israel. After some years, the husband and 2 sons die, and Naomi returns to Israel with her Moabite daughter-in-law, Ruth. There, Ruth meets Boaz, and they are married. To them is born Obed, the grandfather of David and ancestor of the Messiah. Though Moabites were the descendants of Moab, the first of the incestuous union between Lot and his oldest daughter, they were traditional enemies of Israel and associated with licentiousness, as reported in Numbers 25:1. At Shittim, the people, quote, at Shittim, the people gave themselves over to debauchery with the daughters of Moab, unquote. As Kluger suggests, Moab represents the psychic opposite of, or complement to, Israel, the feminine eros side as opposed to the masculine logos side. A very interesting legend informs us that, quote, Moses wanted to war on the descendants of Lot after the episode of Shittim. God forbade this, saying that the 2 nations must be spared because 2 doves were to spring from them, the Moabites Ruth and the Ammonitess Naamah. This Naamah was the wife of Solomon. One version of this legend has God say that he lost something valuable among them, unquote. We can understand the lost value to be an aspect of the feminine principle symbolized by Ruth, while the book of Ruth is a record of the redemption of that lost value. Moab represents the matriarchal Psyche, where the principle of nature and fertility is primary and the masculine spirit principle is subordinate, no more than an instrument to fecundate the great mother. Naomi, however, represents the feminine that has been transformed by encounter with the autonomous spirit, Yahweh, by the autonomous spirit, Yahweh. But in that transformation, something was also lost and requires rescue or redemption, hence her sojourn in Moab. In the Kabbalistic work Zohar, Ruth personifies the community of Israel and also the Shekinah, God's feminine side, who, like Israel, is in exile. According to this symbolism, Ruth's move to Israel and her marriage to Boaz is nothing less than the ultimate conjunctio, which brings about the redemption of both Israel and Yahweh. The theme of redemption is a central part of the story. When Ruth returns from gleaning grain in Boaz's field and informs Naomi that she has met Boaz, Naomi replies, "This man is a relative of ours. He is one of those who has the right of redemption over us." Literally, he is one of them, Golem, Ruth 2:20. According to the Levirate law, the widow who has no son is taken to wife by her brother-in-law or another near kinsman. The eldest son of this marriage is reckoned to be the son of the dead husband, whose heir he becomes. The near kinsman who marries the widow is called her redeemer, Goel. The same term means to buy back and is applied to that kinsman upon whom certain redemptive duties fall. For instance, if a man sells himself into slavery, he shall enjoy the right of redemption after sale, and one of his brothers may redeem him. His paternal uncle, his uncle's son, or a member of his own family may redeem him. If he has the means, he may redeem himself. Leviticus 25:48 and 49. The same term is applied to Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh, who created you, Jacob, who formed you, Israel. Do not be afraid, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by your name. You are mine. Isaiah 43:1. The early Jewish rabbis applied the term Goel to the Messiah, and it has this implication in Job 19:25. Quote, "I know that my Redeemer, Goel, liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth." End quote. There were two near kinsmen, Boaz and another man, who had the right of redemption of Ruth. Kluger informs us that Zohar Ruth identifies these two Golem as the two Messiahs, Messiah ben David and Messiah ben Joseph. These ideas connect symbolically with the fact that Obed, the son of Ruth, and Boaz, is an ancestor of the Messiah. Thus, the union of Ruth and Boaz implies redemption on two levels, the personal, individual level, and the collective, archetypal, represented by the two Messiahs. The core of the story is a conjunctio image, the union of Ruth and Boaz. As Kluger demonstrates, Ruth's nighttime meeting with Boaz can be considered a sacred seduction, with Ruth in the role of sacred prostitute or harlot jewel. Kluger quotes Hosea 9:1 and goes on, quote, "It is permissible to assume from Hosea's reproach that rites involving sacred prostitutes or haradules took place on the threshing floors. The haradul was, after all, a priestess or representative of the goddess and the great mother goddess under whatever name she was worshipped. Ishtar, Isis, Aphrodite, was associated with a lover, Tammuz, Osiris, Adonis, with whom she mated year by year. This union of the divine pair, the sacred marriage, or hieros gamos, was enacted by the priest or priestess on earth, especially at the harvest festivals." Unquote. The same image of a sacred marriage occurs in the Kabbalah. We have already noted that Ruth was identified with the Shekinah, the feminine aspect of Yahweh. She is also linked to Malshuth, the 10th Sephirah. Malshuth unites with Yesod, the 9th Sephirah, as Ruth unites with Boaz, and the result is the union of Yahweh with his lost feminine essence which will restore the original paradisical state of unity of man with God and of God with himself, the blissful union of the rhythms of divine existence in the one great melody of God. The book of Ruth anticipates the conjunctio, which receives its full expression in the Song of Songs. Okay, so that is chapter 7. I've been reading from the Bible and the Psyche, Individuation, Symbolism in the Old Testament by Edward F. Edinger. And I'll just check if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to bring them up. Gray says that Arst is not a trivial physicist either, that's for sure. Um, and so that is the conclusion of chapter 7. There are 15 chapters, so we have 8 to go. I'm going to continue to try to do these readings every day at 4:30 until I'm done. And thereafter, I'll probably take up other readings as time goes on. But, you know, coronavirus permitting. So I hope this is useful to you, and I look forward to seeing you again here. And thank you, Gray, for coming today. Thank you, John, and thank you, Bill. And I will see you tomorrow, I hope.